Good morning. Open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving holiday with friends and family. We had a good time. Daniel chapter 6. We're continuing to move through the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 6 is kind of a break in the book of Daniel. It ends the narrative part. From chapter 1 through chapter 6 are stories that happened to Daniel and his friends. Beginning in chapter 7, we're going to be getting into visions and prophecies and those kind of things for the rest of the book. So Daniel chapter 6 is kind of the last of the stories. And he opens Daniel chapter 6. He pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. Over them 3 officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account so the king might suffer no loss. Now, chapter 5 closes with Darius the Mede getting the kingdom. We talked last week about the fact that was probably a man who in the Babylonian records or in Median records is referred to as Ugbaru, who was the leader of the army who took Babylon. Now, there's a division among scholars. Some people think Daniel chapter 6, this Darius is the same one. There are others who think he's a different individual. There is a man listed in records as being a governor of Babylon after the Medo-Persians took over, whose name was Gubaru. You had Ugbaru and Gubaru, who are both seemingly referred to as Darius. Now, there is a third possibility that people have brought up, and that is that Darius could be another name for Cyrus. There are some who believe that the term Darius is kind of like the term Pharaoh. Egyptian leaders were called Pharaoh, but everyone was called Pharaoh because that was kind of like the term president or the term prime minister. And there are some who think that the term Darius was that. It was the term for the head of the country, and that was a reference to Cyrus. Whether that's the case or not, I don't really know. But he set up an administration for the government. It's very difficult for one man to rule by himself over this large of an empire. You're talking about covering much of the then known world, and he needed help. And so he had 120 satraps. The word satrap is a word that very simply means government official, something similar to a governor, who would be over a certain area of land. The land that he ruled over would be a satrapy, and he's a satrap. We don't use that word very much anymore, and I think there are some of the newer translations who actually use the word governor or administration official. Over those 120 guys were 3 who reported directly to Darius. One of those 3 was Daniel, and Daniel was the chief of the 3. In any administration you set up, somebody's got to be in charge. Any kind of group you set up, somebody's going to be in. So Daniel was appointed to be in charge of those 3, who then reported to Darius. And you need to remember, Daniel is probably at this time somewhere around 84 to 85 years old. We don't know for certain because we don't know how old he was when he was taken captive. The general guess is 14, 15, somewhere in that age frame when he was taken captive. This is the end of the Babylonian captivity, which had been 70 years later. He would have been about 84. There's some indication that Daniel may have lived at least till the end of Cyrus's reign, which would have been another 8 years, which means he would have been at least 92 when he died. Now, even in our day and age, 92 is considered old. But in that day and age, it was especially considered old. The expected lifespan was about 35. Now, part of that was because of the fact that so many children died young, and that brought the lifespan down. But it was very rare in that age for somebody to live in their 80s or 90s. And so if what we believe is true, Daniel was at least 92, and maybe older when he died, and was active in government at 84. Verse 3 says, Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. The high officials and the satraps fought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error of fault was found in him. These satraps and other governors were jealous of Daniel. Why? His success. They wanted his position. There are two other possibilities that may be included in this, and I may go on with this. Number one, he was a Jew, which meant he was from outside of the governmental powers of Medo-Persian Babylon. The third possibility is Daniel was not bribable. Daniel was an honest man who did things the right way. And oftentimes, especially in pagan governments, the way you got positions of power and influence was by bribery and trickery and deceit. And Daniel wouldn't do any of that, which means he wouldn't play any of their games. If he wouldn't play in their games, then he didn't fit in the good old boy network we've always called it. And there may have been some envy of him simply because of that. We can't get him to go along with us. And so they decided they're going to try to get rid of him. They're going to find a complaint against him, but then they could find nothing to complain about. There was no corruption, there was no graft, there were no missteps, there were no things he did wrong as far as his government position was concerned. And so they were left kind of out in the cold. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find in connection with the law of his God. You need to remember, these are heathens. They're idol worshipers. And so they would have believed in a myriad of gods, even though they may have been one, what you might call main god. For the Babylonians, it was Marduk, that they worshipped above all the others, but they didn't have a problem with believing that Egypt had gods and Babylonia had gods and Assyria, all these different places had gods. They have a problem with believing that God had existed, that there was a God named Jehovah. But as far as they were concerned, he was no different than Marduk or Ra or any other god. And in fact, to them, Jehovah was inferior to Marduk because the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians had beat Israel in battle. So that meant their God was greater. But it's interesting in finding the connection with the law of his God. Not the God, not our God, but his God. This is Daniel's God, not our God. We have anything to do with it. But they figured the only way they were ever going to make any headway as far as trapping or getting Daniel in trouble, that we got to do something with this God. And so they come up with this agreement. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "O King Darius, live forever." Notice, first of all, they're using a little flattery. This was a common introduction when you talk to the king. "O King Darius, live forever." All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, agreed the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction. Whoever makes any petition, any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions. Now, I want you to think about this verse for a minute. The first part of verse 7, that first statement is what? It's a bold-faced lie. Because they said all the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors are agreed. You think they went and asked Daniel? He's one of them. Secondly, you have to consider these 120 satraps are scattered throughout this entire empire. There's no way in the world these other two presidents talked to all of these government officials. They got enough that were in their corner that they could go to the king with it. This was not a universal agreement. This was not a universal accord. This was a accord of a bunch of people who were enemies of Daniel. Someone suggested you take 120 satraps. If you want to get a group together to make a decision, you have to have what we would call a quorum, which means 60 people. How many of those 60 people you got to get to approve it to pass it? 31. Half. And so you got 31 you could get this done with 31 out of 120. That doesn't reach the stipulation of all by any stretch of the imagination. No, the first thing they did was they lied. To establish and enforce an injunction, whoever makes petition any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast in a den of lions. What do you think they're using as a basis for this injunction?
It's pride.
Pride. Darius's ego. I'm the king of the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. And you're going to tell people they can't make any request of anybody for 30 days but me. Pride. Now, we're going to find out, as is oftentimes the case, pride gets you in trouble. Because Darius doesn't see through. The purpose of this was not to glorify or exalt Darius. The purpose of this was to get Daniel. That's all this was about. And unfortunately, Darius didn't see through it. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be changed. I think we've pointed this out before, but let me remind you of the fact the Medo-Persian Empire was the first governmental entity that existed in which the king had to submit to the law. If Pharaoh didn't like the law, he just didn't obey it. He ignored it. If the king of Assyria didn't like the law, he just changed it. If Nebuchadnezzar didn't like the law, he did away with it. The Medo-Persians could not do that. One of the founding principles of their government was once the king signs a decree, it cannot be changed. It cannot be altered. It cannot be redone. You remember the story of Esther? They issued a decree, all the Jews were supposed to be destroyed. When they issued the second decree, they didn't say, we'll change the first one. What they said was the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. And so the law the Jews would be destroyed was not changed because it couldn't be. The Medes and the Persians had a great affinity, a great attachment to law and order. And if you're talking about these four great world empires that we've talked about that come one after another, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, Medo-Persia's contribution to the world government and the betterment of people was its commitment to law and order. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. Now, I want you to notice Daniel's response. Now, I think there's something very important here. When Daniel knew the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Those 5 words are vitally important when you try to look at the motive of Daniel. Daniel did not go and pray to flout the law that Darius had signed. Daniel did not go and pray so that he could make some kind of civil upheaval or some kind of protest against the king of Medo-Persia. Daniel prayed because Daniel had always prayed.
He was so predictable, he'd always done that.
That's why they did this. We're going to talk about this, but he'd always done that. He'd always prayed 3 times a day. He'd always prayed 3 times a day within the open, praying toward Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem was their holy place. Even though it didn't exist at the moment, it had been destroyed, Daniel still prayed toward Jerusalem because that's where the temple was. That's where God had placed his name. And since there had not been another temple built, and since there had not been another place where God had placed his name, as far as Daniel was concerned, that's still it. We prayed 3 times toward Jerusalem every day. But he'd always done that. That had been a part of his life. He didn't do this as an act of civil disobedience. He didn't do this to rebel against Darius. He did this because it was the right thing to do. He knew the document had been signed. He knew the accord had been passed, but it did not affect his commitment to God. It's vitally important that we understand our commitment to God comes first, before anything else. And when Daniel was allowed to live his life the way God wanted him to, then he submitted to the Medo-Persian and the Babylonian government. Daniel was a loyal subject of that government. In fact, Daniel was in that government. He was an official in that government, both Babylon and Medo-Persia. But when that government, of which he was a part, passed a law that said, you can't do this, Daniel didn't make a big fuss. He didn't call some kind of public protest. He didn't go screaming and hollering and yelling to the king. He went to his room and he prayed like he always had. I'm going to serve God. And God's going to be first in my life. And that's what you and I need to understand. And need to make the guiding principle of our lives. God is first. God is sovereign. And he gets the first of everything I have. My time, my money, my energy, my effort, my everything. The first of it, the best of it goes to God. So he prayed with his window open. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. What do you think they did when they found that decree had been signed? These guys are trying to trap Daniel. So what are they going to do? They're going to watch Daniel. I have no doubt. They knew he prayed in that window 3. I have no doubt they had people watching that window. No doubt they had people watching Daniel. Oh, this was the whole purpose of this entire charade, was to get Daniel. They came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone makes a petition to any god within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Now, one person pointed out, it said make any request of any, that would include any god. But not only could Daniel not pray to Jehovah, the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians couldn't make any request to Marduk. They couldn't go to any god or any individual other than the king. And so it's limited to 30 days for that reason. At the end of this 30 days, you can go back to talking to whoever, asking whoever you want to. Now again, you need to remember the purpose of this is to get Daniel. They figured 30 days was plenty of time. They'd get Daniel. In fact, I have no doubt they didn't wait a day. As soon as they could, they got him. The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed. You think maybe when Darius heard that, he knew he'd been got? Because the very next thing they say, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now notice they do not say, Daniel, your trusted advisor. They do not say, Daniel, a high official in the government. They do not say, Daniel, your closest advisor. They say, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah. He's a foreigner, he's a stranger, he's an exile. And he's paying no attention to you. You issued a decree and he is ignoring it. The king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Darius didn't want to do this, but he had been trapped. by his own pride. Had been trapped by his own officials, those whom he trusted. He really didn't have a choice. And somebody will pop him and say, well, why didn't he just change the law? Because he couldn't. It was not legal in Medo-Persia to change a law once it had been signed. He could not do that. The power in this kingdom, and most kingdoms since then, the power of the leader was limited. He labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Now, how long that was, I don't know, because I don't know what time they came to the king. But till the sun went down, he was going through in his mind, trying to figure out what in the world he could do to not put Daniel in a den of lions.
This story tells you how much Daniel honored and respected God. Shows you how little honor and respect that these people had for their gods.
Yeah.
And their king. It also lets you know that Daniel had more honor and respect for God than he did Darius, as
Yeah.
he should. And it didn't bother Darius that much.
Yeah. We talked a little bit last week about the fact that the way heathens looked at their gods were there to serve them. Now, they had great powers that men didn't have, but their purpose for existing was to serve me, do what I want, help me. And so their idea was not, we look at Jehovah as being our ruler, as being our sovereign, as being our God who is over all of us. That's not the way pagans looked at gods. Gods were there to help them and for them to appease the gods. But they did not look at their gods like we look at Jehovah. All powerful, all knowing, all present, available to do, able to do just about anything you can think of. That's not the way they viewed their gods. And one of the things that I've always found interesting, when you talk about the reason we believe in the existence of God, Jehovah, one of the things that a lot of people point out is you look at the difference between the gods that man created, the idol gods, the heathen gods. You look at them and their makeup, and then you look at the makeup of Jehovah. Where in the world, if man originated, if man created Jehovah, where in the world did man get the idea of a sinless God? Man knows no such thing. The holiness of God, the righteousness of God, those things man didn't create. And that's the thing that stands out when you begin comparing heathen gods to Jehovah, is his character and who he is. And so they looked at their gods a whole lot differently. But Darius tried, and he tried so long, verse 15, the men came back. Now, O king, that is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. They have no doubt. These individuals knew that Darius was trying to find a way around this. And informing Darius one time wasn't enough. When he didn't put Daniel in the lions den quick enough, they went back to him. And basically said, King, you have no choice. You have to do this. King commanded. Daniel was brought and cast in the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. The probability was this lion's den, or den of lions, was a pit. It's a deep hole in the ground, had like a great covering over the top of it, and near the bottom of it would have been an entrance where the lions could come in and out. some scholars try to make a problem here because they say the practice of capital punishment in that day was to be burned. Under the Babylonians, that was correct. Under the Medo-Persians, it was not. Medo-Persians worshipped fire. The fire was one of their gods, and so they did not use it for that purpose. Their method of capital punishment was lion's den. And they would generally just lift that grate at the top, and whoever was going in, they just dropped them in. And they put the grate back. And the probability is, when they knew somebody was going in the lion's den, they didn't feed the lions for a little while. So they'd be really hungry. They dropped Daniel in, and notice Darius' statement, "May your God, whom you serve continually." Darius is still not saying my God. He's still not saying the God. He's saying your God. Now, at this point, does Darius believe Jehovah exists? Yes. Does he believe Jehovah is the supreme God? Probably not. But it's interesting that when Darius had Daniel thrown in the lion's den, Darius is a heathen. The first thing he turns to for comfort and help, and the first thing he turns to try to get Daniel out, is Daniel's God. What does that tell you about Daniel's conduct before Darius? The way he conducted himself and the way he acted. It tells you that Daniel's faith in Jehovah was evident, was plainly evident. Because that's the first thing Darius brought up. He laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet. What does that sound like? Roll a stone in front of a hole and seal it with a signet. Christ. Remember, they rolled a stone in front of the tomb and sealed it with Pilate's signet. There was a ring, had a special imprint on it, and there was a seal of wax put on that stone and the rock that was behind it, and that impression with that ring was made in that wax. And if that seal was broken, whoever broke it could be executed. That's how they sent private communications from kings to generals. They put it, what we would call an envelope, and sealed it with that signet. And if anybody broke that seal, they'd execute you. And so that seal was put there. The king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. I can just see this picture, and I know this is my own imagination, but I can just see this picture of Daniel or of Darius just tossing back and forth, laying in the bed, trying to go to sleep, trying to get some rest, trying to get some relief from the mental anguish he's going through. Normally, when a king couldn't sleep, what they would do is they would bring him food, and they would bring him music or entertainment of some kind. He didn't want any of that. No food was brought to him. He was fasting, and no entertainment, no music. At break of day, just as soon as he could, the king arose and went into the haste of the den of lions. He came near to the den where Daniel was. He cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Darius is so in anguish and so concerned about Daniel. As soon as he gets within voice range, he hollers, "Daniel!" And Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Now, there are a couple. Daniel, first of all, says, God protected me. God took care of me. God sent his angel. Now, which angel he sent, I have no idea. It just says his angel. There are some who believe this is the pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I think there's any indication of that. Now, could it have been? Certain. Could have been. But there's no proof of that in any way, shape, form, or fashion. It's just God's angel. He sent an angel, shut the lion's mouth. They have not harmed me because God found me blameless. God was not allowed to be punished because I hadn't done anything wrong before him. Now, notice the last statement Daniel makes. And also, before you, O king, I have done no wrong. I have done no harm. What you did to me was unjust. In some ways.
Being cast into the bowels of the earth, the king being like God, lamenting that, and then bringing him out.
I think it's probably, there are some comparisons that could be made there. I think you can stretch those a little too far, but I think there are some comparisons that can be made. The king was exceedingly glad, commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had entrusted in his God. Now, the probability is they're taken up out of the den. The probability is they dropped a rope or something from that grate and pulled, because it's taken up. They pulled him up out of the den. Now, the problem with going around and breaking the seal and rolling the stone, what's going to happen the first thing you do when you roll that stone away?
Won't be a lion.
The lions are coming out. And so they lifted Daniel up, and no harm was found in him because he had trusted in his God. Now, we need to look at this. We talked about this with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel did not know this was going to turn out this way. We read the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and we know how the story ended when we started. Daniel didn't know that. Remember with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, we do not know if God will save us or not. But even if he doesn't, we will not serve your idol. Daniel has faith and trust in God that God will deliver him. God would have delivered him even if Daniel had died. Because if Daniel had died, he would have gone to his father. That's the best kind of deliverance. But the whole import of this story is, we've talked throughout this book about one of the main things in the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. God rules the world, and the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians needed to learn that lesson. And again, God proves he's more powerful than Darius. He's more powerful than lions. He's more powerful than the entire Medo-Persian Empire. Now, notice what Darius does next. Verse 24. The king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpower them and break all their bones in pieces. Now the probability is the people who were thrown in the den of lions were those two other, what we might call presidents or advisors. Remember, there were three, and Daniel was going to be the top one. Probably those other two. But not just those two and their wives and their children. Now to us, that seems barbaric, doesn't it? That seems horrible. It seems awful. But in that day and age, in that part of the world, that was a commonly accepted practice. When you were deemed as being rebelling against the empire, which is what these two individuals had basically done, you were executed. And in order to remove any threat, if anybody tried to take your place, your whole family was executed as well. Now that doesn't seem fair to us. Doesn't seem right to us. What we need to make sure of we don't do is we don't need to judge 700 BC society by 2100 AD society culture. They lived in a completely different world with a completely different set of rules. and a completely different way of life. And the most important thing to understand, they didn't have Christianity. And we do. I'm firmly convinced the driving force behind much of what has happened to the betterment of society and the betterment of culture has been Christianity. Because everywhere it goes, the world changes. Culture changes. People change. What's accepted morally changes because of Christianity. They didn't have that. So some scholars even said, well, the reason Daniel wasn't eating is because the lions were hungry. They'd already been fed. What does that verse do to that? They were broken in pieces before they ever hit the ground. They dropped them in at the top of the mouth, at the top of the den, and before they ever hit the ground, they were broken in pieces. King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever, and his kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. But he who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Now, if I read that from my vantage point, that tells me Darius had become a believer in the one God. That's what that seems to say. There are some individuals who will say, well, he believed in Jehovah as a powerful God, but he was a God like all the other gods. There seems to be a distinction here. He is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. It seems to me to be a description that pagans never made of heathen gods. I believe, and it's my opinion, it may not amount to hill of beans, I believe Darius became a believer in Jehovah.
Darius was probably on the fence anyhow because
Yeah.
of Daniel.
He had already, you go back early, he had already accepted that Jehovah existed. But Jehovah was Daniel's God.
And he had some level of hope, maybe not faith, but hope that Jehovah God was going to deliver Daniel.
Yeah.
He ran down there hoping that that would be the outcome.
Well, when he started putting Daniel the lions in, the very first thing he said was, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And so even before Daniel went in the lions, he had some small understanding of who Jehovah was. And I have no doubt he got that from Daniel. And whether he and Daniel had sat down and had a longer religious discussion, or whether he had just observed who Daniel was and what Daniel did and how Daniel conducted himself. That may be how all this occurred. I don't know. But he had some kind of understanding. Maybe not a full understanding, but some kind of understanding who God was. And when this event ends, here in verses 26 and 27, seems to me, from reading those verses, he's made a complete turnaround.
Daniel is the chief advisor of the chief advisors.
Uh-huh.
He's got a long, long history
Yeah.
in this role at this time. Darius didn't experience all the stuff with Nebuchadnezzar and all that, but he'd been told.
Yeah.
Daniel, right from the moment they got there, went a different way, and everything he did, he was blessed. Not shielded, but blessed. So were his friends. And Darius is not a fool. You don't run an empire like this by being a chump.
Yeah.
So all along he's watching Daniel, and he does not have the relationship with Jehovah God that Daniel does, but he's developing one.
Yeah. I think that's
It's
true.
just in its infancy. Well, now he's got his first one-on-one, here's a moment, and he's already on the fence, and now he sees this great deliverance. He's sold.
Yeah. That's the way I think it happened. I can't prove that, but I think that's what happened.
I gotta believe too, the story of the fire furnace is on.
Oh yeah, all of those stories that earlier happened in Daniel, Darius knew about. I have no doubt he knew about all of that. I think he knew about Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's interpretation. I think he knew about Nebuchadnezzar living as a beast for some period of time and being foretold by Daniel. I think he knew about the handwriting on the wall that we talked about. I think he knew all of that.
And he probably heard that from Daniel's perspective, but he'd also heard it from other people's perspective.
Well, I can imagine, if you were in Darius's shoes, you'd heard all these stories about Daniel, and you finally get to meet Daniel. What's the first thing you're going to ask him? Is all this true? Can't you imagine Darius having that conversation? Did all this really happen? I've heard these stories. I want to know about these stories. Scripture doesn't say that, but human intuition tells me that had to have happened. Curiosity. Just wanting to know. So he asked, I have no doubt he asked Daniel. I have no doubt Daniel and Darius had some interesting conversations that I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. It's simply not recorded because it's not needed for the purpose of the story. The Bible wasn't written to satisfy my curiosity. The Bible was written to tell me what I need to know in order to be a servant of God, in order to get eternal life. And there are a lot of things that I would like to know that I simply don't know. One of the biggest ones is, you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four Gospels together. You know how much of the life of Christ that covers? 6 months. 6 months. What did he do for the other 33 years? Wouldn't you like to know? Can you imagine if somebody sat down and wrote a biography of George Washington and covered 6 months of George Washington's life? The Gospels were not written as a biography. Yeah. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, John talks about the fact many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples. Jesus did a lot of things that we don't know about. And I have no doubt Jesus did a lot of teaching that we don't know about. As far as teaching differently, he probably was teaching the same thing, but just in different localities. But we don't have everything. We don't have everything Daniel did. I mean, you're talking about, if we're right, 92 years of Daniel's life, covered in 6 chapters. 6 chapters. That's amazing to me. And I think sometimes we do a great disservice to Daniel's legacy. Because when we talk about the great men of the Old Testament, we talk about Abraham, we talk about David, we never talk about Daniel. The book of Ezekiel talks about if there were 3 great men who were there, they couldn't save anybody but themselves. You remember who those 3 great men were? Noah, Job, and Daniel. Abraham's not there. David, now that's not to underestimate Abraham. Abraham was the greatest man in the Old Testament. I don't have any doubt. Or underestimate David. What I'm saying is we underestimate Daniel. We don't put him on the same level as we do Abraham and David, and he belongs there. Daniel was faithful to God in the middle of a pagan, immoral, wicked, unholy nation for at least 70 to 75 years. And never buckled, never gave in, never gave up, and never turned on his faith on God, even when the entire empire was opposed to him.
Even when he knew that they laid a trap for him, and it could likely cost him his life, he was still faithful.
There were several instances in this book that's recorded. Daniel chapter 1, he could have lost his life. When he asked to not eat the king's dainties, if God hadn't blessed him and made him as strong as the other people, he could have died. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar could have gotten mad at him as interpretation of that dream. He could have lost his life. Daniel chapter 4, especially, he tells Daniel, you're going to live like a beast for several months or several years, whichever it was. He could have very easily lost his life. Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar could have executed him when he said, your kingdom's going to be... I mean, there was time after time after time that Daniel had a choice. My physical life and my faith in God. And my faith in God comes first. I would like to believe that would be my position. But I've never been put in that spot.
One of the few characters in the Bible that we don't find fault in.
Yeah, he did. Darius did give great praise to God, and that to me is proof that he became a believer in God. Brad?
He's one of the few Bible characters that are revealed to us that God doesn't reveal character flaw in them.
Yeah. That is interesting. Somebody pointed that out before. I hadn't really thought about it before. But you talk about Abraham, you talked about he lied. You talk about David, you talked about he committed adultery and murder. You talk about most of the great men of the Old Testament. There's some character flaw. There's something short. We don't find that with Daniel. And that doesn't mean he was perfect, because no human being is. But he was. We don't need to underestimate the faith and the dedication and the commitment that Daniel made to God. And we can learn a great deal from that. Daniel is, I think I mentioned this when I started this class, Daniel is my favorite book in the Old Testament. I love the book of Daniel. And next week, it's really going to get interesting. Because we're going to get into some visions and some dreams and some prophecies and some things that I find totally amazing in these next several chapters. I think I went a little bit past time, but I'm done. We'll pick up at chapter 7 next Sunday morning.